They stood at the corner like two small, exhausted sentinels, twins, identical in the way sorrow makes children look older than their years. Their clothes were stained with city dust, their hair stuck to their foreheads with sweat. One held out a crumpled scrap of paper as if it were a passport out of the day. Clumsy handwriting, a fold pressed into the center, edges damp with fingerprints. People stepped around them. People looked away. Raul Meirelles stopped. He did not mean to. He had walked this avenue 1,000 times, the same stride that brokered deals, the same hands that closed contracts and smoothed signatures. He knew how to ignore interruptions. He also knew how to see when a small thing demanded attention. The note trembled as a thin fist offered it. One of the boys, more open, cheeks freckled, eyes a shade too trustful, murmured, "Please, sir, read." Raul took the paper with fingers that habitually weighed numbers, not dirt. He unfolded it as if unfolding a ledger, and then the words tightened something in him. Short lines, a plea masked as instruction. "If anyone finds my children, please take care of them until I can return." The handwriting was hurried and half wet, the kind of script written between sobs or between running steps. He felt a small, immediate shock that had nothing to do with money. The sentence itself held both confession and surrender. He read it twice, once aloud under his breath. The syllables of a mother's panic seemed to hang in the air with the bus exhaust and the city chatter. Around them, life moved like water around a stone. Horns, a hawker calling, the clatter of a vendor's cart. People spared them glances and then kept going. A woman 3 paces away muttered that it was too dangerous to take strangers' problems. A man in a suit hurried past without meeting the boy's eyes. Raul noticed these small refusals with a curious precision, the way someone trained to see risk notices the beginning of a crack. Something in him, older than his suit, older than his apartments and investments, said, not loudly but with a weight he couldn't ignore, "Take them somewhere safe for the night." He bought them food. The action should have been simple, transactional, a sandwich, 2 bottles of juice. But watching them eat, how they shared a single packet of salt with the seriousness of a ritual, the way the guarded twin turned the bread into something he guarded like treasure, Raul found himself unmoored from his usual dispassion. The mansion he lived in had rooms so quiet that silence had become a decorative element. Tonight, he thought with a nearly guilty relief, it might have sound. He hailed a cab with the casual authority of a man who could make things happen. The twins climbed in with the hesitance of children who had been taught to keep hope small. Raul sat in the back seat and noticed their hands, one thumb chewed to the nail, the other hand clasping the scrap of paper like a rosary. The drive home cut the city in two. Outside, late summer dusk, the river of cars, the neon of shop signs. Inside, the limousine of his life, cushions, the faint smell of lemon polish, the echo of conversations reduced to business. He thought, absurdly, that he had never had anyone in his house who was not a client or a carer. The idea of noise, small feet, coughing laughter, the scrape of a chair, was both foreign and, he realized, desirable. At the gate, the mansion stood in a hush of white stone and clipped hedges. The door alone had the quiet of an institution. Donna Maria greeted them at the threshold with the practical calm of someone who had been keeping a household together longer than most marriages lasted. She took in the boys with the swift maternal assessment of who needed blankets, who needed soap. "Leave their coats here," she said, voice lined with the kind of authority that comes from knowing exactly where everything should be. Raul observed her hands, the silver at her temples, the way she straightened the boys' collars like a ritual that might make the world less dangerous. Sir Joachim, the driver, was there too, quiet, steady-eyed, an archive of years of commuting between the intimate life of the employer and the outer public world. He greeted the twins with the sort of small warmth reserved for children he'd seen grow up on city verges. "You look like you could use a bath," he told them. The boys smiled in a slow, blank way, relief and shame mixing on their faces. They ate at the back table under a chandelier. Raul sat apart at his customary place, the edge of the room, where he could watch and yet remain untouchable. The mansion filled, for the first time in months, with small animal sounds, the clink of cutlery, the ravished whisper of a napkin, a laugh so small a bird might have made it. He told himself, half to the room and half to himself, that he would call the authorities in the morning. He would do the sensible thing. He would let the professionals take over. This was the behavior of a man who calculated responsibility in a ledger. It felt right. It felt, too, like a plan that would re-establish boundaries. But boundaries are porous. Sleep came that night in a way Raul had not expected. tired, interrupted, threaded with the thought of the note and the way the younger twin hummed himself to sleep, as if song could stitch up hunger. In the bedroom hall, a portrait of his younger self at a launch party looked down at him with an expression he'd stopped recognizing. Smug, triumphant, certain. Raul walked past without meeting his own eyes in the glass. Morning light found the house warmer than it had been the night before. The twins moved with a curiosity that made everything in the rooms look suddenly privileged. The piano, the jars of sugar, the balcony that overhung a garden where citrus trees kept their smell like a secret. The wilder boy. There was a difference between them. One carried wounds like shields, the other wore them like open palms, found the kitchen window and pressed his face to the glass to watch a sparrow. Donna Maria kept them to ritual and order, a bath, clothes laid out like new promises, a plate of rice and beans that the boys accepted with the solemnity of strangers crossing a threshold. Raul watched. He noticed how the boys argued softly over a piece of bread, as if bargaining for more than food, for attention, for a place in a world they had never been invited into. The decision before him was simple on paper, and not at all simple in the place where choices were born. He called a woman at an agency he had used before for property checks, someone who knew how municipal things moved. The instruction was precise. Inform the proper authorities. Follow the standard procedure. If you find children alone, the protocol is to notify child services and the police so the children's legal status can be clarified. When Raul told Donna Maria, she folded her hands and said, "We do what is right." It was not a platitude. It was a rule. Dignity for the living, order for the household. At the police station, the air smelled of detergent and bureaucracy. A uniformed officer sat at a worn desk with a patience that had the sheen of long rehearsal. Raul signed forms that were mostly boxes and faintly bureaucratic phrases. The officer placed the crumpled note on the table and read it aloud into a machine that catalogued phrases for records. Names were taken, the boys' details recorded. The words, "standard procedure," came up again, and Raul felt a small relief in the shape of legality. The system existed in part to prevent improvisation. The officer made a call, and then another. "We have reports of an abandoned mother," he said into the receiver, the sentence flat with the weight of such notices. They checked databases. They asked the twins to say their names. The guarded one said nothing at first. The other supplied a name, a stub of syllables that fit awkwardly into the forms. An identification would require time, documents, perhaps the intervention of shelter services. Some of that Raul did not want to imagine, and it had the antiseptic taste of processes that are both necessary and insufficient. Then they told Raul there was a woman at the station. They led them to a waiting area where fluorescent lights made the boy's hair look pale at the edges. The room was filled with small noises, the shuffle of shoes, the rustle of papers. And then there she was, Lucia Almeida, thin, cheeks hollowed, eyes drained of their earlier fire but fiercely fixed on the twins. She moved toward them, running on the ragged thread of a maternal instinct that had kept her standing. In a single motion she gathered them into her arms like a parent claiming the only thing the world had not yet removed. Raul watched the reunion and felt something unfamiliar climb his throat. Lucia's hands trembled against her children's backs. She smelled of wash and public baths and cigarette smoke. There was a metallic edge to her voice when she spoke their names, as if naming them again made them more real. She apologized to the officer for the inconvenience, and then, when she saw the boys, apologized without words to the world that had demanded such choices of her. Her mouth formed apology like a prayer. The twins clung to her with a mixture of anger and relief. The guarded one watched Raul for a fraction of a heartbeat, and in that glance was the question, why did this man bring a house? Why had he looked? The other boy leaned into his mother's shoulder, as if such a place might finally stay put. The officer asked questions, brief, bureaucratic, about how long she had been separated from them, whether she had a place to go. She answered in fragments, lost job, unpaid rent, a night where the landlord had said there was no choice. She said the words in the clipped rhythms of someone who had rehearsed them on the way here, and in the small moments when a decision was made, to leave them with a note, with a hope. Raul stepped back. He let them have the private reunion they had won back by the force of a mother's claim. He felt, oddly, like a specter in their small orbit, present but unentitled. Yet there was a small practical problem sitting on the lap of the officer's clipboard. Identity. Proof. The world that ran on forms required paper to confirm flesh. Lucia produced a work card and a torn municipal ID whose laminate had cracked. It would be enough for the officer to record who she was, but it wasn't enough to erase the suspicion the system was built to feed on. They would verify. They would check neighborhoods. They would consult shelters, search databases. Raul was told in the formal tone that a company's rules being applied. The agency must follow its steps. The officer looked at Raul and asked how long he intended to keep the children if verification took longer than a day. Raul said, "As long as it takes." The word surprised even him. He meant to be reasonable. 1 night, 2 nights, while papers moved, while Lucia found her feet. But the way his hands curled around the edge of the form felt like a promise. They returned to the mansion with more people now. The twins, Lucia, Raul, Dona Maria, Sir Joaquim, and a polite constable who had come to record the faces. The drive home was quieter. Lucia sat next to the boys, her fingers woven with theirs like a ribbon. She watched the pillars of the estate with an expression that held both bewilderment and guarded gratitude. Raul watched her watch it. He had never known how to read the expression of a woman who had been shut out of a world. Back at the house, the atmosphere shifted again. The mansion was both hospitable and alien to someone who had spent nights in shelters and stations. Dona Maria smoothed a blanket over the twins with the devotion of someone folding away trouble. Sir Joaquim busied himself with the children's jackets, his hands moving as if to arrange the scene into something protective. Lucia kept her eyes low. The shame of being a woman who had left her children showed in small betrayals. The way she avoided looking at the silverware, the way she hesitated at the threshold of the bathroom as if the tiles were an ocean to cross. She thanked Raul in the spare language of emergencies several times, each thank you less like gratitude and more like a negotiation with pride. She told him, in a voice that went thin at the edges, that she had meant to come back. She had thought she would. The city had swallowed days. A lost job had become a swallowed street. She told him about nights on benches, the city's lamps making the hours look like theater, and about a promise she had not the power to keep. Raul listened without comment. What could he say that would not sound like a ledger entry? He was not a father. He had contracts, children of a sort, assets, investments, properties, but not the raw, unpayable debt of a child's need. He felt some private accounting begin to stir. The years of being measured by profit margins, the sacrifices that had been called necessary and then celebrated, and yet the ledger had never accounted for the cost of the absence of belonging. When the boys were settled in a guest room with 2 small beds, Lucia lingered in the doorway. The twins had left a small ring of crumbs on the nightstand that a child's tiny theft of bread could not erase, the trace of a domestic life they had briefly occupied. Lucia touched the crumb ring with the gentleness of someone who had the right to take what remained of their night. Raul found himself watching her as if he were seeing a memory he had misfiled. There was something in her profile that pricked a loose piece of his past. He could not name it then. He only noted, with the clarity of someone cataloging objects, that the photograph tucked in the boy's pocket earlier, he remembered, oddly, the weight of it, had felt like a relic. He had not thought much of it in the station. Papers were papers. But now the recollection threaded forward, pulling something else with it. He told himself he was tired, and that the mind stitched connections when it wanted to justify action. He poured himself a coffee in the kitchen that tasted like overwork and old meetings. Dona Maria watched him from across the counter, hands folded. "You did a kind thing, boss," she said, in that tone that is both reproval and approval. He bristled at boss, which reminded him of the roles he played, but he could not deny the small warmth that her words brought. "We did what we could," he said. The usual political correctness of owning nothing of what matters felt, in her presence, absurd. She smiled without indulgence. "It's not about money, it's about being present." Days moved in small increments after that. The authorities sent a letter, a phone call, a polite note of confirmation that verification was ongoing. They came twice to ask the same questions again. Lucia registered with a shelter program and with an agency that promised to help with housing searches and employment. Raul offered to help pay for a lawyer to sort the preliminary paperwork. He phrased it as an administrative support, a way to get things moving faster. Lucia said thank you as if she were naming a favor that belonged both to practicality and to pride. The twins began to leave their marks on the house. A crayon drawing of a sun with jagged teeth appeared on a paper taped to the fridge. A toy truck was found in the laundry room behind heaps of clean linen. At night, the quiet of the mansion became a different thing. Not emptiness, but something waiting to be filled. It was during one of those ordinary nights that the photograph revealed itself. They had been sorting the boy's small bag, trying to account for what the world had left them with. A few plastic toys, a worn comb, a small coin someone had kept perhaps to hope for a bus. Donna Maria sorted gently, her hands like a steady current. The guarded twin kept to himself. The open one placed each item on the bed, like a story told in small parts. A tooth-marked photograph slid from a folded napkin. Raul recognized it in the way a man recognizes a line of his own handwriting after years away from it, faintly and with a suddenness that made his pulse step. A young man in the picture smiled with a looseness Raul had not granted himself in decades. Beside him stood a young woman with the same face as Lucia, only younger, the shadow of years not yet carved into her features. They were beside a table in a boarding room or a small cafe. The photo had a grainy optimism, two people leaning in, the world small in the background. For a moment Raul could not place the face. Then a memory ignited like a match struck in a dark room. A boarding house on Rua das Flores, a cheap coffee that tasted like hope and cigarette smoke, a night that had been full of promise and poor jokes. He had been base-handed with promises back then, the kind you make when you are young and feel invincible because you have nothing to lose. He had been kind in ways that cost nothing. Or perhaps he had promised and then measured the cost and left. There had been a woman then, a thin thing with coal dark hair who knew the names of every borrowed book and who did not flinch at a man's pride. Lucia's face, older and beaten but carrying the same bones, slipped into clarity. The photograph fell to the carpet with a soft sound like something broken. Everyone in the room felt, in the measured silence that followed, the air alter. Donna Maria looked up as if sensing the shape of a revelation. So Joaquim scratched his ear, an old man's small ritual for processing news. Lucia's hand went to her mouth. The twins watched like animals, aware that a storm had started somewhere outside the walls. Raul held the photograph and felt all his balances shift. The years that had taught him to weigh people in margins of risk and opportunity now seemed to him like thin measures against a fuller accounting. The shock was not the recognition of a face on paper. It was the recognition of a life he'd left behind and the sudden impossible looping back of consequence. The children on the bed were his compatriots in a past he had not acknowledged. He thought of the crumpled note again, the line that asked for a kindness until return. He found himself looking at Lucia not as a case file, but as someone who had stood in the same shallow trenches of survival he had once known in a different form. The photograph was a hinge. It suggested that the street had not thrown them together by accident, that the moment of the note was not a random plea, but a return to an unfinished ledger. He wanted to ask, but language took on a strange, brittle quality when he tried to speak. His voice, used to negotiations and measured tones, felt inadequate. Instead, he laid the photograph on the table and tried to let his face be honest. Lucia's eyes fixed on the image like someone who had been waiting for a proof. She did not smile. She did not look away. Instead, she tilted her head, as if listening for the sound of a memory. The twins crowded closer, the guarded one with a suspicion, the open one with a kind of hope that had not yet learned to be careful. He did not know, in that suspended moment, whether what he felt was guilt, a responsibility newly found, or a fear that his life would begin to need a different kind of accounting. The photograph made his earlier decisions look less like administrative kindness and more like a reckoning. It complicated the neat line he had thought he drew between the man he had been and the man he had become. "Do you remember this place?" Lucia asked finally, her voice the texture of someone testing a fragile bridge. Her question was careful, like someone tapping an old window to see if it would hold. Raul swallowed, and the answer came out small, a syllable that carried years. Yes. For a second, their shared past clustered around them, scenes in grayscale flickering like old film, a streetlight buzzing behind their shoulders, an argument over rent, a promise made without resources, laughter borrowed from a life not yet cruel. The photograph had become a key, and a lock at once. It linked him to a time he had deliberately archived. Donna Maria cleared her throat, a sound that reminded everyone the world continued to turn. The practicalities returned with sudden force. The paper forms, the legal steps, the verification of identity that would determine whether the reunion would stick or be torn. The officer's protocol, the shelter's rules, the slow churning of municipal systems. Each one a machine calibrated to keep order, not to heal. Raul felt the twin currents inside him pull at the same time. One was the precise, administrative current of a man who knew how to make things official. Pay the fee, sign the form, hire a professional. The other was quieter and more disorienting. The urge to right a wrong he could not confess to offer more than paperwork. The photograph demanded not paperwork, but something that could not be stamped at a counter. He found himself saying, not in the tone he used with clients, but in something softer and less practiced, "Tell me how I can help." The words were immediate and clumsy at once. He did not, in that moment, realize how much they meant. Lucia's eyes filled in a private way, a small, surprised relief that had nothing to do with ego. But the house had not yet become a home. Floors still gleamed with the sheen of careful design. The curtains were still drawn in such a way that the world outside was politely obscured. The photograph lay between them like a contract that had slipped into the wrong drawer. For Raul, the revelation hardened into a question. What did restitution look like when time had changed faces and created debts in silence? The twins had drifted away to their corner with the toy truck and the crayon sun. In the dimness of the drawing room, Raul turned the photograph over in his hands and saw, on the back, a smudge of ink, and in one corner a faint notation that might have been a date. He had been on the edge of choices once. Now he stood at a different edge. The note, the photograph, the return of a mother. These things had collided in his life and left a new map. Decisions no longer charted by profit, but by obligations that felt, unexpectedly, moral and intimate. He thought of the crumpled paper again. "Take care until I can return." The line had been a plea and a promise. Now, with the photograph pressed like a truth into his palm, it also read like a summons. Outside the window, city noise went on as though nothing had shifted. Inside, something had. Raul placed the photograph gently on the table, as if careful handling might prevent it from shredding into consequences. He felt, for the first time in years, a panic that had nothing to do with markets and everything to do with time. How it had passed, what it had taken, what it had left behind. Donna Maria watched him, the wisdom in her eyes unshaken by the suddenness of revelation. She stepped closer and, for the first time since the boys arrived, used the familiar diminutive he had not heard in years. "Raul," she said, and there was a patience in the way she said his name that did not demand explanation. "Whatever you do, do steady." The word steady landed like an anchor. Raul looked at Lucia, then at the photograph, then at the two boys who had drawn suns in crude crayon. In the niches of those small items, the note, the photo, the drawing, lay the architecture of a choice he had not planned to make. He did not decide in that moment. He only realized that the choice, when it came, would not be a single act, but a series of tiny restorations. Paper turned into action, legal forms into pathways, a house into a home. He understood with an unignorable clarity that his life, measured in square meters and ledger entries, had acquired a new currency, belonging. The photograph was a hinge. It had swung the door of his past open and revealed something he had thought he had closed for good. The sound of it was not dramatic. It was the small, stubborn noise of consequences arriving like mail. He pressed his thumb against the edge of the photograph until the paper warmed. Lucia's hand brushed his. An accidental touch, quick and charged. Neither of them spoke for a long time. The twins, suddenly aware of the gravity between the adults, resumed their game with renewed seriousness, as if their play could anchor the fragile world. A soft chime at the door announced another visitor. A municipal caseworker came with a packet of documents and a practiced smile that masked the fatigue of seeing lives break and stitch back together in uncertain ways. Her arrival was procedural and necessary. Raul put the photograph into an envelope, as if a piece of his past required protection while the world sorted itself. He signed more forms. Lucia sat beside him and watched the pen move like an instrument of fate. They did not speak of the past out loud. They did not yet need to. The photograph lay folded in his pocket like a pulse. As night fell, the mansion's lights warmed the garden, casting long, forgiving shadows. Inside, the household moved into a rhythm that was both new and ancient. A child's laughter, the clink of dishes, the low hum of the television filling a room without demanding attention. The house held these sounds like a patient host. Raul stood near the window looking out at the silhouette of trees. He felt suddenly tired in a way he had not been tired for years. That bone-deep fatigue that follows the admission of an uncomfortable truth. He had, tonight, taken a small piece of paper into his hands and had been startled by the life it carried. The photograph had been the louder echo. He made a plan that sounded like practicality. Help with documents, temporary housing assistance, a job lead through a contact who owed him a favor. He would do these things. He meant it. But underneath the plans, another impulse had begun to take shape, one less amenable to spreadsheets. To be present, to learn the contours of a life he had once been near but had chosen not to enter. When the twins went to bed, the crumpled note found its way into Raul's palm again, sticky with the residue of a night of handling. He smoothed it on the coffee table, the paper flattened like a map of decisions. The handwriting blurred at the edges, but the meaning did not. If anyone finds my children, please take care of them until I can return. He thought then of the return that had not yet happened. The photograph had answered the question of coincidence with the evidence of connection. It made every choice feel less like a random act of charity and more like the beginning of restitution. He did not, in that moment, decide precisely what restitution would look like. He only understood that his life had been realigned by the discovery, that his ledger had gained an entry that could not be closed with money alone. The note, the photograph, the children, these were now part of his account. Outside, the city continued to press against the night, indifferent. Inside the mansion, a small trio of people slept in borrowed calm. Tomorrow, there would be calls, appointments, perhaps resistance from systems that make slow work of repair. Tomorrow he might falter. But tonight he allowed himself the small, dangerous luxury of imagining a different currency, the weight of being needed, and the strange return of a promise made years ago by someone whose name he now knew. He walked to the bedside of the twins and watched them breathe. In their faces he saw timelines compressed, what had been lost, what might yet be repaired. The photograph lay in his pocket like a secret he had not yet earned. When he closed the door, and the house settled around its brief domestic chaos, he understood that an old promise was stirring in a new way. It did not demand immediate resolution. It demanded attention. And attention, he thought with a weary clarity, was sometimes the most costly thing of all. Morning arrived with practicalities. The caseworker returned with a folder and a steady schedule of visits. The agency followed its steps, and the verification process began in the quiet, patient way institutions do. Papers were copied, numbers checked, names confirmed. Nothing miraculous happened in those days. The world moved forward in forms and couriers, in phone calls that asked the same question twice, and then once more for certainty. Raul learned to sign documents with a new kind of care, the stroke of a pen holding more than a ledger entry. He wrote his name as if it were witness and not ownership. They made a temporary arrangement that kept the boys with him until the verification concluded. It was neither permanent nor casual. It lived somewhere between bureaucratic language and human need. Raul could have treated it like a short-term errand. Instead, the house took them in. Small routines settled like dust motes in sunlight. Morning smelled of coffee and slightly burnt toast. Lucia, when she could manage it, sat at the kitchen table and watched the boys discover the patterns of a home that did not move on them. She did chores with careful hands, unafraid of the labor, but careful with pride. Donna Maria taught her where to keep the flour, where the sweet spoons lived, the little economies of running a household that were, in truth, exercises of trust. The twins changed the rhythm of everything. The guarded one began to answer when asked a name, at first in fragments, and then with a syllable for each request. The other, who had lived by being open to small kindnesses, learned the luxury of a predictable bedtime. Raul started arriving home earlier than he had in years. Meetings that once ate his evenings shrank as he found himself inventing reasons to be where the house was loud. He moved a framed award from the top of a shelf to the closet and replaced it with a crayon drawing that had a son with too many teeth and a house that looked like a boat. He did not announce the exchange. He simply set the drawing where he could see it. There were small resistances. Lucia bristled at offers that felt like charity. "I didn't want them to be charity," she said once, folding laundry with the mechanical surety of someone who had always valued work above alms. "I wanted them to have a place to be when I came back. I thought I could come back." Her voice never rose to blame. It only folded in on the weight of a promise that had been hard to keep. Raul listened. He offered work, not alms. He had a contact in a community project, someone he had known through a philanthropic dinner years ago, who needed a practical, organized person to help run a small kitchen that served children after school. It was not a grand position. It was honest labor with a steady paycheck. When he suggested it, he did so in the tone of someone with a plan, and the humility of someone who had learned to value practical help over gestures. Lucia did not accept on the spot. She walked in the garden and considered the offer like she was reading a letter from an old friend. Then she said quietly, "If it pays enough for rent, I'll take it." The sentence contained both negotiation and relief. It was not gratitude alone. It was a step toward rebuilding a life. The months folded into a montage. The house grew louder in ways that made the rooms look warmer. The twins made a habit of leaving small signs of their passage: paper planes, an orphaned sock, a string of macaroni beads that someone had declared a necklace. Raul learned the anatomy of makeshift mending: how to knot a broken toy truck back together, how to stay in a room while someone sobbed and not feel the need to buy silence. He sat at the kitchen table and listened while Lucia talked about nights she had spent on benches, about a man named Antonio who had once stood between her and a harsher fall. She did not ask for forgiveness. She narrated the facts as you might report weather. Windy then, the storm, then aftermath. Antonio's name settled in Raul like a slow, remembered ache. Lucia described him simply: quiet, a little rough, loyal in ways that cost him, and then she fell into a pause that held the rest. "He took a different road," she said once, as if naming what happened made it bearable. "He believed things would get better." The rest she left blank and full of its own meaning. One evening, when the light in the garden had gone honeyed and the air smelled like cut grass, Raul found himself sitting beside Lucia on a narrow bench. The boys were chasing one another past the azaleas, their laughter like small bells. The house had settled into the sound of ordinary life. The photograph rested between them, still worn at the edges, still carrying a young version of two people who had once made their decisions in a different economy. Raul's voice was small. He could not do the clean executive summation he'd perfected in boardrooms. "I remember that place," he said. "I remember the coffee. I remember feeling like we could make anything with a few borrowed coins and stubbornness." Lucia's eyes found his in the way that catalogued a lifetime. "You left," she said simply. There was no accusation, only a noting of what had been and what had followed. Her hand found the photograph and smoothed the corner as if the paper were flesh. He could have explained in any number of ways. He had reasons once: ambition, fear, the intoxicating promise of safety built from work. He had learned, in the years since, that reasons stacked up like thin paper walls. He had not been cruel. He had been careful in the ways he knew how to be careful. But that care had a cost he had not accounted for. A life of solitary precision, where promises go unsigned because they are inconvenient to hold. "I left," he said finally, the phrase like removing a bandage. "I thought I was buying a future. I thought I was protecting myself." He stopped, because finally, for once, explanation felt like a poor substitute for apology. Lucia listened. She did not soften immediately. Survival had taught her to measure words. Then she looked at the boys and back at him, and a kind of truce took shape that required neither absolution nor denial. "We all made choices," she said. "We paid for them. We still do." They did not reconstruct the past into a tidy story. They held small truths and let them be what they were, facts that intersected now and demanded work. There was no cinematic confession that fixed everything. Instead, there were practical adjustments. Raul apologized in small ways. He learned the names of the boys' favorite games. He sat at their crooked table and taught them how to fold paper planes with the patient inelegance of a man learning to be small. He listened to stories about schoolyards he had never known. Institutional steps continued alongside the slow, messy human ones. The agency completed its checks. The police closed their notes with verification complete, and a standard phrase that felt both helpful and numb. The months of paperwork were not dramatic. They were a terrain to be navigated. Raul financed the legal counsel needed to regularize visits and parental rights in the short term, phrasing it as administrative help he would provide. He refused to let the papers be a curtain that hid the boys. He wanted the world to know they had a place to return to each night if needed. There were moments of friction. The guarded twin, who had learned to object to being looked at, once slammed a door and fled to a corner of the garden. Raul found him there, knees drawn up, his face set against the oak logs. Raul sat on the stone beside him and did not speak for a long time. Then, very simply, he asked if the boy wanted to teach him how to make the toy truck run again. The child hesitated, and then, as if the asking gave permission, showed Raul the broken axle and how to bend it back. The repair was clumsy. The truck did not run like it once had. It rattled, and yet the boy handed it back with a look that began to trust. For Raul, the act of being present while someone repaired a thing became an ordinary sacrament. It was not a rescue, it was attention with hands. Work at the edge of transformation was not all softness. There were nights when Raul found his old instincts pulling. A business dinner that called his name, a deal that required signatures. He honored some of these obligations and declined others. He began, slowly, to tell aides and partners that he needed his evenings free, appointments for the boys, a PTA meeting, a doctor's visit. It was a radical minor rearrangement. The day that had once belonged to commerce now had pockets reserved for calls about who would pick the younger one up from school. Donna Maria watched these changes like someone who had lived through storms and seen small reparations matter more than grand gestures. "You're learning to keep the house," she told him once, with a smile that did not mock. Sir Joachim, who had made a habit of waiting with the car as Raul moved through his errands, began to bring the boys small paper boats he made from the backs of old menus. He taught them to fold a crease that would keep a boat afloat. They learned to launch them in the gutter after a rain and watch them go. The photograph and the crumpled note found their place in the home. Raul framed them and set them together on a shelf in his study, not as trophies but as reminders. The frame was simple, with a small brass plaque that read only what needed to be said: returned. It was not a grand statement of absolution. It was a promise kept small and visible. The boys, when they discovered it months later, insisted the plaque needed to be bigger, and declared it would be better if they added a drawing. Lucia laughed and did not stop them. She taped a sun above the plaque and called it good. Time's passage shifted things more than any single action could. Lucia worked the kitchen job, rising early and learning the routines of a different life. She saved in small envelopes. She learned to navigate buses, to arrive on time, to be at once proud and tired. There were setbacks. One landlord late on a payment, one nurse who called them in for a cautionary meeting at the school. But the pattern was steady. The household did not dissolve into crisis. Raul's help had opened doors. Lucia walked through them. At nights, when the house settled and the twins slept with their breath small in the dark, Raul sat at his desk and sorted through his appointments and his feelings. He did not believe his life was simpler now. Complexity had simply shifted form. Where once his ledger measured apartments sold and profit margins, now it also recorded the nights he had read stories to two boys who were better at skipping stones than he had ever been. The emotional turning point arrived on an ordinary afternoon. It was too small to be dramatic. A parent-teacher meeting at the boys' school had been set for after lunch. Raul had promised to attend. He stood in a small gymnasium painted in cheerful colors and listened as a teacher said the youngest was doing well in class, that his handwriting was improving. The guarded twin, who had once refused to join games, had answered a question in front of the class. Raul felt, in that thin instant, like a man who had been given back an absent value. On the way home, while the boys compared stickers with an intensity that made Raul smile, Lucia took his arm in a light, deliberate gesture. She thanked him, not for money, not for paperwork, but for something quieter. "You didn't have to," she said. Her eyes found his like someone measuring the distance of a long road. "You didn't have to come back." He did not make a dramatic reply. Instead, he answered simply, "Neither did you, but we did." They had, in the unremarkable line of days, become a family by the accretion of small acts. The mansion's rooms had softened. The study, once an office of solitary triumph, began to hold other things. Children's drawings pinned with proud imperfection, a chipped mug that had been decorated with glue and glitter, the framed note and photograph that no longer read like guilt, but like a map of what belonged to them now. There were no triumphal banners. There were, instead, ordinary signs. A birthday cake that was lopsided, a phone call from a teacher with good news, a minor illness that they weathered together. These were the measures of belonging. When the time came to make a firmer arrangement, they did it the cautious way adults must. The authorities had completed their verification and clarified the legal routes available. Raul offered resources, legal counsel to regularize visitation, and to help Lucia secure stable housing, and a quiet proposal, one that respected her dignity and agency. He would provide an apartment in one of his developments, processed through standard channels, with assistance for rent until a lease and job would sustain them. He proposed helping Lucia find trustworthy legal representation to navigate parental status and custody processes, not to short-circuit them, but to ensure the children's rights were protected and not lost in red tape. Lucia read his proposal like someone reading a contract. She did not accept wholeheartedly at first. She hesitated with the same guarded care she had given promises before. Then, after a week of thinking and watching the boys practice their multiplication tables on the back porch, she said quietly, "I will try. But this must be asked of me, not given to me like charity." He agreed. The difference mattered to her, and it mattered to him. It was not about the transfer of wealth. It was about the recognition that the dignity of a person is held in the same scale as the need of a child. They moved forward. The apartment was modest and facing a courtyard with a small playground. It was arranged through official channels. A lease was signed. Help was offered to cover the deposit and the first months. Lucia began a course in basic bookkeeping the agency recommended, and Raul leveraged a friend to get her a part-time job in a small administrative office. It was not a dramatic, transformed life in a day. It was steady work. Months later, on a humid morning with the air smelling faintly of rain, the boys brought home a drawing taped to a school folder. The paper declared, in a child's jagged letters, a statement that held the gravity of a pronouncement: "Here we stayed." The guardian twin had added in smaller letters, "We ate hot soup." Raul stuck it to the refrigerator with a magnet shaped like a sun. He stood back and felt an odd, quiet pride that had nothing to do with profit and everything to do with the long patience of growing roots. That night, before the house settled, Raul walked to the shelf in his study. The frame containing the crumpled note and the photograph looked less like evidence and more like a reliquary of change. He ran a thumb across the glass and thought of all the small transactions that had gone into the life that sat behind him: paperwork and meals, embarrassment and conversation, apology and acceptance. He had not saved anyone in the grand narratives he once liked to narrate. He had, he realized, allowed himself to be saved in an ordinary, reciprocal way. He thought of Antonio and the young promises they'd all once made. He thought of the years of absence and arrived at a simple accounting. Restitution is not a single act. It is the daily currency of presence. On the porch, the twins were making paper boats from the last pages of a newspaper. So Joaquim had taught them the crease that would hold water. Donna Maria had tucked the boys in with stories of strange uncles and gentle warnings. Lucia was washing a cup, humming a melody that had nothing to do with advertisement jingles or company logos. In the house, laughter moved in regular waves, the small, irreplaceable noise of belonging. Raul closed the study door softly. He did not need to mark his transformation with speeches. He let it be counted by small things: a child's drawing on the refrigerator, a photograph returned to honor, a note framed not as a relic of shame, but as a reminder of what it means to answer when someone asks for help. Outside, the city moved on as it always did. Deals signed, lights flickering, people walking past other people with decisions still to be made. Inside the mansion, now more house than monument, a different set of reckonings was underway. 2 boys slept with the sound of their mother's breath nearby. A woman worked during the day and came home to a family that recognized her as necessary. A man who had once measured life in square meters had learned to keep time by the sound of children's footsteps. When morning came again, the photograph and the note hung side by side on the wall of the kitchen, under a strip of light. The plaque below them was a child's edition now, crayon letters that read "Home," with an extra A shaped like a heart. Raul looked at it and felt no need to measure his intentions against the ledger. He had been changed not by a single revelation, but by the long, imperfect arithmetic of being present. In the end, the crumpled note that had started it all, the plea to care until return, kept its place on the shelf. It reminded him that a life could be rerouted by a small piece of paper and an act that refused to look away. The mansion still had rooms and ledgers and the quiet of its stones. But it also had the rattling of a toy truck, the smell of soup on a weekday afternoon, and the framed proofs that what had been abandoned could be met again and held. On a quiet evening, when the twins were tucked and Lucia was folding towels, Raul stepped to the balcony and watched the light go down over the city. He thought of returns, of obligations, and of how heavy, at times, the cost of attention can be. But he also understood, with the simplicity of someone who has been given a second accounting, that attention is the currency that buys belonging. He brought his hand down to his pocket and felt the photograph there like a small, warm weight. He smiled, not at himself so much as at the improbable sequence of small decisions that had made a house into a home. Inside, laughter rose again, and for the first time in a very long while, the sound made the walls feel like permission. If this story moved you, please consider liking and subscribing to follow more stories of quiet change and human return.